Hi, everyone. I'll just reiterate, thanks for, if you can, introducing yourself in the chat and turning your cameras on, maybe especially if you're speaking, but even if we have you just by voice, that'll be just fine. This was, I hope, accurately advertised as a conversation. And so I want to thank you and welcome you to a conversation about which I can claim no expertise on the basis of experience, but only share what I imagine is a shared sense of urgency in developing a sufficiently capacious perspective for this particular moment. I hope our conversation will be wide-ranging. We'll be leveraging our collective knowledge to help us think about these tasks and commitments to teaching literature in these days. So I want to begin just a little bit impressionistically in a way that I hope will bring us to a couple of opening questions. By the phrase in the title, that's not part of it, by the phrase in the title, time of coronavirus, I mean not only the way that disease has altered our daily lives and interactions, but how it's exposed and capitalized on inequities in labor, how other events, the resurgence of racial disparities, the vibrancy of Black Lives Matter and coordinate responses are refracted through our personal awareness and our communal awareness of fragilities and strengths. Isolation, both personal and national, has raised, at least to me, vast questions of how literature, writing, communication itself matter. And finally, attacks on science seem to me as well attacks on aesthetics and on the humanities. I will say bluntly, I will be starting the fall semester more exhausted than I ended spring, with the added complexity of preparing for classes that are a bit like Schrodinger's cat playing with yarn. So I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about where I'm thinking to move us into some questions. So I was in January scheduled to teach 2 fall courses on existential fictions. These are syllabi that generally begin with thinking about the emergence of existentialism around the world wars and end with its streaming into popular culture. This is for me a familiar course. I've been teaching it since at least since I was a graduate student. And they usually require just a little brushing up. Am I going to start with Sartre's Nausea or The Age of Reason? Will it be Springsteen and Madonna this time, or Prince and Bowie? What kind of final projects do I want? Of course, these decisions are always tinged by the current moment, but they're contained within the course's relative stability, what I call a kind of passive presentism. But now it seems I need to ask more of the course to see if I can find a way for it to deliberately offer existential fictions to help students grasp their own existential positions in the midst of crisis. This pivot and my ambivalence about it is what brings me to this discussion. I hope in playing off Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera isn't too cliche, but that a bit more is going on than just mere alliterative echoing. In particular, the way temporality itself, which is always referenced in Marquez's novels and even his titles and defamiliarized in his narratives, has become palpable. Whether it's in the form of waiting or boredom, the time you calculate of your exposure to someone unmasked in a supermarket, the days until school start or until the election. I get 20 emails a day reminding me of that. Memes joking about the 43 days in the month or the time saved walking across the room to work. Well, literature has always been alert to these multiple temporalities, whether it's Fielding, playing on the differences of the time of writing and of reading, Nabokov in his Invitation to a Beheading, noting how the physical book itself marks time as the pages move from the right hand to the left hand. And for my course, of course, the view of temporality itself as arising as a function of human negation and fragility. Sartre's No Exit, you may remember, the play that takes place in hell is without time because it's forever. But the main characters then struggle forever in order to even begin that timeless space. So wherever our conversation roams, I suspect time will be a recurrent element, whether it's our time as an epoch, our relation to time, literature's penchant to play tricks with time, or to expose time's tricks, like death playing chess in the Seventh Seal. We're a relatively small group. That's a good thing. But depending on the turns in the conversation, we might drop into breakout room. We'll just sort of decide along the way. Again, feel free to use the chat to add to the conversations. I have a few visuals, which I may or may not bring in. We'll just see how that goes. But now, as Edgar sort of says at the end of King Lear, now seems as good a time as any to speak what's on our mind. So I thought we could begin with these particular questions. How has this moment brought you back to literature as comfort or for clarity, to manage stress or to experience pain more fully? Does a novel seem relevant to you now when the task of writing out a shopping list, at least for me, seems an utterly daunting literary task? Are there new forms of literature emerging and capturing your imagination? Are different voices striking you with more urgency? Does your own sound different to you when you read or write? Are you reading anew or rereading? Where does this flux locate literature for you personally? I thought we could just begin with a sort of set of personal issues and sort of move into classroom from there. So I've talked long enough for a bit. I'll open the floor.
Wendy, I don't know if you want to ask your question out loud, or maybe your sound is not good, but I can ask Mark on your behalf.
Oh, am I not coming through clearly?
No. I just had muted myself.
Oh, Wendy, you were asking. Oh, excellent.
Sorry.
No, I was typing a question to say, I would wonder, I'd love to answer all the things that you just said, for sure, but could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by passive presentism?
Sure, and that was something I was going to come to later, so it's as good now.
I can wait if it's okay.
No, I don't mind bringing it up now because I think it is really important. So when I teach, say, romanticism, which is my specialty, I'm always aware that students are going to pick up connections to our current day, and I pick texts that I know will resonate, but I don't go out of my way to make that resonance part of the course, right? I don't teach a course that we might call romanticism for our day. But that's a very legitimate way of teaching romanticism, and one that people have certainly been arguing with the climate crisis ought to be how romanticism is taught. And I'm sort of asking whether or not we need to, wherever we're teaching, to be thinking about sort of what we call active presentism, a more aggressive form, or whether, just how much do we want the present to come into our classroom if we're a medievalist? How do we want to manage those kinds of questions? So that's what I meant by that.
And, I was thinking this morning about my college English teacher, Dr. Templeton. And he seemed very old to me at the time. Who knows how old he was? But during the time where we were shutting down the campus for Vietnam protests, for Teach It, and I was very involved in that effort, I kept going to his class. He kept teaching. He never said a word about what was going on in the world. He just went up to the blackboard, and it was an advanced English grammar class. It was something that most people couldn't get their head around why that even mattered right now with the world on fire, which is what it felt like in that era. My friends were being drafted. It was a very different time. And so I was thinking about him because I couldn't bear for the thought of him just standing up there teaching to nobody. Partly it was my heart, the future teacher myself, I guess. But also there was a part of me that said, yes, language matters, grammar matters, it really matters. It's going to get us through this. And now, 50 years later, I can say that was certainly true. Years later, I wrote him a note about that and saying how much I understood now why he kept on teaching and had a longer view. And he wrote me back the most beautiful postcard in his elegant, looked like 1890s script. Again, I'm dating him, much older than he was, but it was so formal. He said, I appreciated your kind note. Thank you for thinking to send it to. And it was something very, very formal and lovely, but I was so glad I reached out to acknowledge him, because I see that happening all over again now, which is why that was on my mind, as though nothing matters except the current moment. Nothing matters except the cause of the day. And yet,
right. And I guess that
we have to make everything relevant to the cause of the day, or can we just also, is there part of us that just wants to, as politically active as we are, hold on to some things that, so that's where your thought about active versus passive presentism led me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's sort of exactly, in some cases it's easier if you, obviously, if your course sort of already points to this moment. But even for people in those conditions, sort of what is the role of literature? And, in a certain way, one could sort of reframe that as, we have, and I have a few of these, I thought of a number of old like chestnuts about literature, right? Things that most people who teach literature believe about it. And do those beliefs change, right, at this particular moment? Does what you want to get done in your classroom change? Now, I had, set out in the description of today a few general questions, and I have some sort of more specific ones. But I don't know, does anyone else want to sort of join in and sort of how they're personally thinking about literature? Because I actually find I'm watching old movies these days. I sit down next to me when I read them, when I watch them, but I rarely open them. And obviously I need to make sure I know those books I'll be teaching in the fall, but I've actually found reading really hard. I don't know if that's a general thing, or it's possible many people have actually found, boy, this is a great time to be reading, and have made their way, through remembrances of things past again, or the Brothers Karamazov, which is out in a new translation. Others who want to sort of join in on that question? No? Oh.
It's been a lifeline for me. It's been an absolute lifeline for me. I can't stop reading. I've read more than I've ever read before. It's always a lot. So that's my way. I started coughing though, so that's why I moved away.
Okay. Others? And feel free to either just unmute yourself and jump in.
I'm reading differently. I mean, I'm reading.
Say a little bit about that.
I'm reading a lot of French detective novels for some reason. It's just something that can keep my mind off of things.
So escapism and
Escape.
Almost. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course people have read escapistically, to make up a really ugly word on the fly, for ages. In fact, some of the works we teach as canonical were written as escapism. And of course, one of the things that's interesting about that is they never let you escape as far as you hope they will. Right? They sort of wrap you back in to their moment, or your moment, as the case may be. And I don't know if that is a way of sort of starting to think about what we might want to do in our classrooms that are differently. Um, yeah, Jackie says dystopian books as escapism, and would that they were escapism. You know, and in another way, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about that is I feel like we're being bombarded with new forms of literature. You know, I don't like the word bombarded. That sounds negative. I didn't mean it that way. Because there's just been some absolutely brilliant things, you know, on internet parodies and so on, you know, that I think are part of rethinking, but also somehow manage to preserve that distancing effect of literature. Right.
If I could jump in, I wanted to offer a point. My name is Brian, and I'm a high school English as a new language teacher in the Bronx. And you know, I was thinking about the story from Wendy, and I'm wondering if you know, how different would it have been if you think that professor did actively engage with what was happening? How would that have transformed the dynamic? And you know, I'm thinking like, I'm an educator, but I'm also a learner, and as a white person, I'm actively trying to train myself to become the best anti-racist I can. And I also want to foment that in my students. I'm also building an anti-racist community at my school. So I think, I do think there needs to be acknowledgements of this crisis that we are in, while also recognizing the relationships we have with our students. I mean, I want to provide a space that's engaging, that's safe and comfortable as possible, but also for to recognize that literature and storytelling is also healing. And so to create that space where students can tell their own stories, given that they are in this moment with us, while I also see that I don't want to. Well, I also see that it can be re-traumatizing to engage in conversation around coronavirus repeatedly when that's something you're feeling on a daily level. So I think I do think that acknowledgement at the very least needs to happen.
Right. I mean, one of the ways I was thinking about that, right, is in general, I think most of us work this very careful balance between making our course space a safe space for students, but an uncomfortable space. Right. We want them to be thinking outside their comfort zone, but knowing in doing that, the outside, right? But what happens when everywhere is suddenly uncomfortable? Right. I mean, you know, does that change how we approach that? Right. And, you know, I don't, and I hope you were sufficiently warned, I don't have any real answer to that, other than to think about, you know, how do we really make sure our courses build communities where people can somehow safely say enough already? One of the interesting things, and again, this will be different for different individuals, depending on what levels that you're teaching and so on, at least for a lot of my students, my freshman seminar on existentialism will be the class in which they talk. Other classes, they'll answer questions, but they'll largely be their intro, you know, math course, their intro, whatever. And this will be, you know, their introduction to themselves course. And so, right, the kind of discomfort I want there at the same time, you know, usually represents a real change from their outside world. Now, I just, you know, everything seems uncomfortable. So do others have thoughts about how they want to go about creating safe spaces, how they want to go about teaching, hard stuff, troubling stuff that sort of changed in a day where, things are so troubling? Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit in terms of teaching modalities. Like this spring, when we were all online and teaching online, I was teaching Latinx and Latin American literature, and I found that the students were making connections themselves to a lot of the issues that we are seeing in the text, as well as that we're seeing today in terms of authoritarianism, social protest, revolution. And the online space actually maybe gives them an opportunity to be in a safe space. And if you build a community where they can talk about things that with a little distance, that distance that comes with a mediated technology, and the ability to write out their words and think about them and before they post them. And it gives less of that maybe immediacy, and it allowed them to have difficult conversations and to check each other in certain ways that I think in a classroom may at times be more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if other people have had that similar experience, but one way of sort of framing that, which also jumps ahead to one of my other questions, right, is what affordances do people see for online teaching? And one way I want to sort of think about that in particular is there's a lot of things you can't do online that you can do in your regular class. Ray Ringel in her talk yesterday had a very nice comment about, sort of accepting the loss. And once you accept that loss, you can start to build. And what that made me think about is, well, literature is so often, and I know I'm using that in a way that sounds like it has a capital L, which I semi-apologize for, is so often about loss, but loss that transforms in a way that produces no new possibilities.
Can I say something?
Of course, that's what we want everyone to do.
Awesome. Okay. And hi, I joined a little later. I'm actually not an educator. I'm a writer, and I was an proud English major. So, okay. One thing that I think is really important to consider is the sort of deeper underlying mechanisms that come with literature. And one of the reasons why I think hopefully any of us love to read is I think that the literature has the unique power to help with empathy. And I think that that's going to be one of the key factors in helping bridge different cultures, different places. And so stories of characters and people and things that because we might come from different backgrounds, but I think emotions are universal, and we all experience frustration and pain and all that type of stuff. So finding ways to help that I think or books that have like strong characters in that particular sense. One that comes to mind for me, Octavia Butler has a really good book called Kindred that was probably the best book on like any sort of race relations that I've ever read. And so just things like that move your heart really and move you to transform. I think that's like a good way to go about doing things. That's just my 2 cents.
Worth at least a quarter or better.
Yeah. Thanks.
In these days of small change.
I agree with you, Mary. My name's Kristen. I don't have the capacity for video if you hope to hear me, so it's one or the other. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for all of your interjections across the board, all of you. I teach Boccaccio, and as I mentioned in the chat, Boccaccio is really having a moment for the first time in my career. I was actually in class in the middle of lecture when my university sent out the message to all parties that we were going to be effective immediately suspending all in-person classes. And my class usually runs until 5 p.m. They said that we were suspending classes as of 4:20 p.m. that day. So quite literally, my students had to leave the classroom, and that was the last that we saw of each other for the semester. But as opposed to them leaving the classroom traumatized, I think for the first time in their lives of literature, they felt as though Boccaccio was going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them. The first line of the book is that it's a matter of humanity to have compassion for the afflicted. And so they've been learning throughout the course of the semester how to put oneself into someone else's shoes and to try as best as one could to adopt a perspective that they weren't born into and that they didn't necessarily have any training for, but that they were presented with as a way of trying to help them develop empathy. And clearly all of you are familiar with Boccaccio enough to know that though he focuses a lot on the plague in the introduction, the rest of the stories, once the protagonists are outside of Florence, focus on just about everything but the plague. And so my students were able to find in this kind of feast for the intellect and emotions enough to satisfy them and to reinforce their strengths and to give them courage to confront some of the issues that they then immediately had to confront upon leaving the classroom. And so I was very impressed by the ability for literature to have been able to embrace a situation like this and to be able to help steer everyone through it. And as opposed to finishing the semester where students could have felt depressed or demoralized or tired of talking about COVID or the effects of COVID on their lives, they instead felt as though the book gave them the hope to be able to reconstruct a universe according to new values and new virtues, with a hope that they could actually become builders of a new society. And so I find myself inspired more than anything now, as a great return to literature, I think, could help all of us kind of reinvest in the conversations that are going to be necessary to sustain and maintain a democracy.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I both appreciate the optimism of it and appreciate the evidence on which that optimism is based, which I think is really important. And I've been thinking a little bit about how do certain of those kind of key texts, which I return to kind of again and again, you know, how might they be deployed in a kind of different way or have a different kind of resonance? And are there ways, in fact, that the online environment might actually be able to enliven the communal effect of them? So I had one thought. I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. And I'm going to, this is going to make, yeah. Okay, you're going to get me in sort of sideways view in order to get the screen. This is my second screen. And let me get this poem so it's all there. This is a poem a number of you may already know, and many of you may not. And either way, that's fine. My students are usually in that exact balance. This is Keats's When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. And one of the kind of amazing things about this poem is he never publishes it, and there's no real evidence he intended to, right? That he was really using this to think through what it meant to write. And usually when I teach it really formally. I'm going to use the annotation tool here just so people can sort of follow me along a little bit. Let's see. Actually there, yeah, good. Yeah, okay. So one of the sort of obvious points that I always get to, and I'll just, you know, this is just a couple of quick points about the poem. I hope people can read it, but it's a really sort of hyper sonnet, right? It's 3 quatrains, all of which begin the same way. When I have fears, when I behold, and when I feel. And there's not a hard rhyme in the whole way until you get to the end, where suddenly you get a couplet of the hard sound think and sink. And I always teach this as being about writer's block, which it is. But it actually, it seems to me to be kind of readable with all these different formal elements as about suspension, right? And thinking about these whens, which first are show up as trochees and then get the accent here. And I feel like, you know, one thing about the way I'm doing this now, right, is you can actually do this with a class, right? Put a poem up here, which they haven't read, and have them all really close to it, right? The first time they read it through, and they're all on the same copy of it, which I think is a remarkable thing. Because and then they can all, in this case, right? I could have you all start annotating this poem, right? You all, I haven't checked that annotation has been activated for you all, right? But you all could be pointing out things you noticed, and it could be quite a wild discussion. I'll stop sharing because this was just a sort of general point. But to, you know, so, but there's a kind of way in which, right, one of the thing that online reading can do, right, it is often in class what we'll do is we'll ask someone to read the poem. And everyone else are semi-listening or doing their own kind of reading. They make their marks as they go or whatever. Whereas here, they can literally be looking at the same, it's not the same screen, but they can, you know, through that screen, the same image, right? And so when they annotate, their annotations join together. And I think, so this was, for me, this poem was kind of a very just reassuring moment because it did two things for me. One, it gave me a sense of something I could do just with my class that would be better than the way I usually do it. All right. And this is a particularly good poem because the meter of it is incredible. I mean, Keats is teaching himself at this point how to write sonnets by writing them. He's not exactly writing them. So it's a sort of perfect pedagogical tool too. And so that's kind of going on. And then to sort of think about how doing it online might actually be a benefit as opposed to, so I think that goes to exactly that idea that there are ways of increasing closeness that that the online can really help. I mean, for me, what part of it is, when I think of forming community in a lit class, I think it's critical that that is formed through the literature, as opposed to we sort of develop a community that walks over to the literature, right? And I know that's not a great metaphor, but actually, I'm going to cheat again. I'm going to share the screen one more time really quick. And I'm going to just go to another moment. Okay, can everyone see this poem? Okay, I'm not going to do what I usually do in class, which is I make students, I said, okay, you, and I picked someone randomly and they have to start reading this poem. If you don't know the poem, the first thing you'll do is really struggle with it. You won't get anywhere near it because the LA and the LE at the top are going to just throw you completely off. It actually reads, I'll ruin the poem for you by telling you what it says in some sense, right? A leaf falls in loneliness. You'll guess, of course, that it's E.E. Cummings. Not of course, you may. The thing I like about this poem is what I do with it is I have the first student read it and they don't get it at all. And then the second student reads it and gets a little bit of it because of how he heard the first student read it. And the third student, she gets a little bit more. And the fourth student, they get a little bit more yet. And usually in a couple rotations around, suddenly the poem makes sense. And so what we do with it, right, is first we kind of communally discover the poem by communally reading it. And use that as a way to kind of think about how all reading is communal. And you can see how a poem like that and then a poem like Keats's have a kind of really interesting dialogue. And they're both about loss, and they're both about aloneness. And they're both about traditions that the writer doesn't quite fit into or feels their own space in and distance from. All right, so there's kind of nice things one can do with that poem. We've kind of, as I had hoped, jumped sort of ahead of my questions in any sort of organized way. But I thought maybe it would make some sense to actually try going into some small groups and just letting people talk a little bit about what they're actually teaching and how they might want to go about teaching it, with the idea here being, specific texts. And those of you who aren't teaching texts, either because you teach another subject or because you're not teachers, the way I'd like you to join in the conversation is like, you might think about texts you'd want to talk about with people you care about. Because if that's not teaching, I don't know what is.
Hi.
So.
Can I speak?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. My name is Monica. I'm from Mexico, and I am teaching literature here in Mexico, and I teach a specific text that called Pedro Páramo, which is very, very interesting and very hard to understand. And well, this is a very deep experience for my students, and my English isn't very good, but I will try to explain. In this course, we go through the book and through the lines. I ask the students how they, what can they see through the book in between lines. And it's a very deep experience because the book is all over the semester. And well, this is my experience, and it's very interesting to do that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, and that's a sort of perfect lead-in into going into groups. I mean, I think it would be interesting for us to put some particular works forth. And, if you need to explain it a little bit because others haven't read it, that would be great. But the idea is to really kind of think about how do these books help us address this moment that we're in?
Okay.
Or how do they help us manage this moment, even if by not addressing it even, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways literature is going to operate in this time. But one of the ways it can't operate is being not in this time when we're reading it in this time,
Mm-hmm.
right? It
Yeah.
has a multiplicity of relationships to it, even the idea of rejecting it, right?
Yeah.
But so does that make some sense as a way? So shall I put people, and I'm just going to put, or actually more precisely, I think Dane will handle the putting people into randomized groups. If you could, once you're in your small group, turn on your cameras for that group, that would be great. And I think probably 4 groups, Dane, maybe. And I'll just let you all talk for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to just hop around. And if you know how this works in Zoom, it's different from in a classroom where they see you coming and you can hear multiple conversations. You pop in, you frighten them, and then you pop out like a ghost. So it's a very different experience of small group work for me, at least. But it has some, again, advantages, affordances, and some disadvantages. But I won't know unless I happen to be in your group. I'll have no idea what you're doing. So I'll tell you now, you've got about 10 minutes to do whatever it is. I've set what I'd like you to do. I can't enforce that in any particular way, as with my students. Okay, would groups like to just share a highlight or two if you have them? You don't need to, if, you know, sometimes conversations don't lend themselves to highlighting. But did any particular thing come up?
Well, for me, it's a very interesting experience. It's the first time I do something like this in English. And thank you very much for all you say and for listening to me. Thank you.
Okay. So I can see already there's a lot, I've got a number of questions that we're not going to sort of get to necessarily, but I'd like to actually maybe return to some of these questions that again are for me kind of like that we haven't touched on yet. They're kind of like chestnuts that you always have to figure out. And at least for me, I kind of had figured it out, you know, 20 years ago. And, you know, and you know, it became a kind of set practice and I think needs rethinking. And so one of them in particular is this. How much of our own politics or personal life do we put on display in the classroom? You know, there's no magic answer to that in general, right? We all have our different ways of doing that. You know, you could read a lot about me just from what's behind me, unless I'm the size of a postage stamp on a small computer. But, you know, I've been really trying to sort of rethink, I mean, and part of that, I'll just sort of ramble for a moment to sort of why this seems urgent, right? Is, you know, I have to admit, I'm not as politically flexible as I was once able to be. I don't feel like there are two sides to many of these issues. I feel like there's one side and a number of lies. And, you know, at the same time, I understand as my kind of ethical duty is not one to inflict that view on people. At the same time, I actually feel failing to make that view present actually leaves people, and the most vulnerable people, get more vulnerable. So the question of how much politics I want to be in there, the question of how personal. I'm going to say a few personal things for a moment. I mean, one of the things I started doing when I was trying to figure out why COVID was screwing with my mind so much is starting to keep a list of everything that was happening because of COVID to people who I knew at either 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And that list just keeps getting longer and longer and worse and worse. And, you know, I actually think through that for myself as to who I am. But I don't know where that plays in, if at all, in terms of the classroom. Right? Normally, I have a certain classroom persona. I like my classroom persona. I actually like him more than I like me. But now I don't know. And I thought it would be interesting just to sort of get other people's takes on those questions. So are you having to rethink the question of your own politics and your own personal life in the classroom? Or have you set it up in a way that you can just continue on as you have it? In which case, maybe what is it?
Can I say, I have a thought. This is also kind of something we spoke about in our small group. Wendy had talked about trauma and about how it's so important to name your trauma. And I think that one of the things to consider, especially with like all the issues affecting different minorities, for example, or marginalized communities, is how, and I think it was Brian maybe who had said something earlier about how is my, if I am expressing this viewpoint, like, you know, I guess kind of balancing it against the sort of greater good of like, is this going, could this potentially re-traumatize someone? Could this potentially, you know, make someone really upset? Or, I mean, to an effect, you, like you had said earlier, Mark, about we're supposed to make people uncomfortable too in the classroom. But I think it's a balance in a lot of ways. But I think that is at least an important lens to look at things through. That would be the first thing that comes to mind. So
Yeah, agreed. And you know, I've been rethinking, you know, some of these books and movies that I teach, and I go, oh my God, that happens in it. You know, because I don't pay attention to plot myself that much until I'm teaching, right? It doesn't register with me. And it's like, how am I going to talk about that? Or how am I going to avoid talking about it? What are the costs of avoiding talking about it? And then this whole right, you know, but yeah, no, I think you raise a really interesting, you know, issue for us all to be kind of working out. Others?
I was curious, Mark, for all of you that teach. So I know from my experience with teaching and many that I know, there's not always that flexibility to make changes to your curriculum that you would really want to change. So I'm curious if maybe you're thinking about how to rethink the way that you're teaching the things that maybe you're stuck with having to teach because of your curriculum.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, right, so there are two versions of that, right? One is you're kind of given a curriculum, and this applies, you know, to many faculty. And the second is you're teaching a section of a larger course that has certain specific works that you can't get out of. And, you know, I'm fortunate, at least for this next semester, not to be in either of those circumstances. But I am sort of stuck with, these are the texts I already know work well in this class, and I'm having a very hard time surrendering some of them. So in a sense, that's me disciplining myself in exactly the same way as if I were given the syllabus. But another way of kind of reframing that, right, is, I mean, are there ways in which you're sort of worried about particular texts or trying to think about new ways to grasp particular texts that you may not, maybe had been available before, but wasn't necessary before, that now feels like I have to take on this aspect of it. I have to highlight that aspect. You know, in the way the Iliad shifts from being anti-war to war, depending on the time, to use a weak analogy.
If I understand, I don't know if I understand, this book that I talk about it, Pedro Páramo, I read a book almost 35 times, and each year, each semester, I find new ways and new words and new realities that I didn't see before. But the book is something extraordinary, and I just can't believe that every time I start with the book, vine a Comala a ver a mi padre, that sentence means anything else every time I teach. So that's amazing for me. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just to follow up on that, I mean, I do think, you know, I mean, there are a lot of works where you see something new going in. And maybe the best moment is when it's not you who sees something new, but your students do. And I feel like, I mean, I've been taking a lot of courses on how to teach online and trying to learn about building community and stuff. But I feel like fundamentally, I'm not going to know my students as well as I do in a face-to-face class for quite a while. And one of the possibilities, I think, is if we can think of ways, and, you know, obviously many people have been doing this already in different context. But even now, right, are there ways in which these new modes of teaching can really allow us to allow the students to lead, right? I'm cutting way back on my reading. I'm going from 5 novels to 3 novels. Cutting way back on the official writing assignments, so that there can be more informal. And then I'm going to really, I've always had a final project, but it's always kind of come at the end. And it's been, now I'm going to actually start very early on the final project. And it's going to involve students talking to each other to develop that project. I'm actually using digital stories, so they'll be making their own sort of existential video on something. And that something, I suspect, will be about the present. And it'll be interesting to see. And they'll be doing it, obviously, with a lot of support, but with their being almost immediately more expert in it than I am, because it's their story. And, you know, what I'll be bringing to it, and what I hope the class will be bringing to, is with the existentialism being, offering them certain templates by which they can think through those stories, right? When I teach nausea, the first thing the students notice is there's no plot, which is what part of the reason I like it. But then I sort of teach against that as to highlight what the plot of nausea is. And I feel like things like that are going to work in terms of giving students these very active assignments, more so, and more to the point, earlier and with more trust than I do in general. So let me sort of, you know, that's just one example of the digital story, which I actually think is a really fun assignment for students, although very time consuming, and I need to make sure I give them the time in the classroom, in the class space, let's call it. No, even that doesn't work, right? Class time space continuum, maybe. But are other people thinking about sort of major shifts in assignments that, and obviously some of us are doing it for various reasons, but I mean in particular shifts in assignments in order to make the literature itself pop in particular ways, right? Since in theory we're mostly, in this group, for this moment, interested in literature.
Can I say one thing? I'm sorry, I know I'm not a teacher, but one thing that Brian actually, he posted the Black Lives Matter link. One thing that has come up in learning about anti-racism for me, especially over the past few weeks from a position as a white person, is how important it is, one, to listen, and two, how that correlates to literature is, I think, purposefully including other voices from other cultures in their own words. So purposefully seeking out sources that are not just told by your typical, you know, like white male from like the 17th century or something. As valid as those are, it's like expanding it. So I think it's really intentionally seeking that out. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Others?
Yeah, I would like to say that what I have learned from, you know, several workshops that I have attended about teaching online is that because last semester what happened is that I had to, like all of us, switch to online from face-to-face classes. And what I have learned is that, like you mentioned, Mark, that we have to focus more on student teaching center, or excuse my, I think I have it switched the words, but because instead of lecturing for, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes by Zoom, we won't get the same attention if perhaps in the classroom, some of us don't get all the attention from all students, Zoom makes it even more difficult. So I think that, as you said, giving the students more time to reflect, giving students more time to learn, or take responsibility for their own learning, and perhaps recording our lectures, short lectures and things like that. That's what I will be changing mostly in my classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a way in which we're flipping our classrooms, whether we want to or not, and for some of us sort of re-flipping them, right? I mean, it gets to be complicated. Another aspect, right, is obviously with Zoom and the visuality of online teaching, right? I mean, one of the really good sessions I went to yesterday was from an economist whose name I'm blanking on. I apologize, but it was a terrific session, and he was sort of talking about doing everything visually, and I thought, oh, that's great. I'll teach movies and TV shows from the Romantic era, and that didn't seem like it would work. Obviously, there are paintings and lots of visual stuff, so there's a lot of visual culture available. But another thing I thought about is something we can think more about, especially because getting books for students, this came up, and one of the other small groups was talking about this, is tricky, right? They can't go to the usual bookstore. It needs to be, can they get it on Amazon and so forth? But actually thinking about the visuality of particular books. So if you read Romantic era books in first editions, they're really different books, right? And so is there a way we can take some of the advances in book history work that people have done and pay attention to, there are some great online editions which really help make clear, right? Boy, is it different to read a poem when 14 lines take place on 2 pages, as opposed to the top third of a page in an anthology, right? Just the visualness of that is a completely different poem. The volume itself speaks differently. Internet Archive, Haudi Trust, both have these kinds of editions. And a particular genre I've been thinking about, now I've blanked on the name of it. Like playbills that are, 1-page, like ballads. What are they called? They have the writing and they're usually Gothic and there's little
broadsides.
Thank you. I've only published on them, but thank you. So broadsides, right, are this really interesting, and they're great databases that have really cataloged them well. And so there, it's not just going to the visual, but helping students use the visual and their visual skills as part of their reading. And obviously we could have done that, and people have done that for, decades of teaching. But I think this moment actually lends itself to that in a really interesting way, because we can post it. We can use works, sites like Perusal, which another group was talking about, right? Where students can multiply annotate the same page. Now, I wouldn't recommend having 20 students annotate a single broadside. That could get, or maybe I would, I don't know. Maybe smaller groups to look at different broadsides, right? And then they become experts in those broadsides, and they bring that to the classroom. And so I'm not even lecturing at all. They're teaching each other in something that is the intersection of writing-based literature and visual literature. And I think thinking in those kinds of terms, right? I have made also the decision, as I said, I've cut back on the number of books I'm teaching. I'm maintaining the number of movies. So I teach 3 movies in this course. I've switched out what they are entirely, but I'm still teaching the same number because I think that'll help get the students to their own visual, verbal representations in the digital stories I'm having them do. So that's the kind of sequence of it. So I think visual works really well, but I think thinking about how we can use it to get them to see what it felt like to read at the time. Obviously, they don't really read at the time. You can't read in the, history is unfortunately a one-way arrow in certain ways, relentlessly. But I think you can do things like that. Yeah, Chris?
One thing I do with visuals, and you were talking about final projects that might not be papers, but using visuals is I teach a class on modernism, so 1920s, American and British, and for the final project, I have them do choose a media artifact from that time period, whether it's a modernist painting or a jazz song or an early film, and connect it to the literature of that time period and create either like a presentation or a website or a Padlet or something like that where they can combine the visual and the text and look at similar themes that are appearing or ways of representing different topics or historical context for that time period. And they really like that project to get them to think about the literary text, but also to use visual media kinds of artifacts in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course there are some great websites for that kind of thing. Within modernist period, the World War I website has some great stuff, and and actually one of the great things, for all of our periods or cross periods or however we define what we're doing. But yeah, those kinds of projects. Something I thought about doing just at the beginning of class, and I'm thinking through possibilities, is asking students how they read things differently. Right? One of the really fun things, as many of you know, about teaching freshmen books that they read in high school is to give them the sensation that they never really read it that first time, right? That they read something different. And I wonder whether or not it would be worth, having students, could see even doing it, having them read something at the beginning of class and then read it again at the end of the course and actually ask about that difference, but also ask about reading it, even just text that they have read before. Bring in a passage and tell us how it feels differently to you today in our current time, and using that to help understand where they are a little bit more. Because I think, of course, it's easy to understand in general terms, but one of the real tricks we'll be facing is how do we understand where they are in individual terms, right? For each individual student, and of course, that's not going to be stable. I don't think there's, we joke about why, how many grandmothers die so that papers can come in late. I would never make that joke now. You can't make that joke anymore. Every student we have is going to live in a closer relationship to death than most of our students. Not all, and of course for some, for many, there are students for whom this is nothing new because of, all kinds of disparities in which they live. But there are certain ways in which, the world will have shifted for some, and, and so, even things like, if you know Margaret Duty's book on the origins of the novel, which is not what it's called, the real history of the novel, I think it is, right? And she points out that all novels begin with a reference to death. That's of course not true. But once you sort of start thinking about that, it's remarkable how often it is true. novel, and the novels I teach virtually all begin that way. They begin even with the main character dead. Right. So the question of how those kinds of works play now when this discussion of fragility and death rates are just a regular thing being presented in our news today raises really interesting questions about the novel. And I think will probably lead some of us to do our scholarship differently, as well as our teaching. That's a bit of a ramble, but I'd like to, you know, are there other things that people feel are like radically changing the conditions of how literature is meaning for us now?
I'm sorry, I can't both talk and hear you and also have my face on camera. So as for that, but I think that something that has been changing for a while is, and is going to be even more pronounced, is attention span. I think it's really interesting that you've talked about cutting back your novels. I also am trying to cut back in my syllabi, because I think with everything going on, my own attention span is shorter, and certainly our students will be.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think I already confessed to my fairly absent attention span, or my absolutely complete attention span to certain things and its inability to wrap onto others, right? I mean, that might be a more, and so, you know, and I do think it is worth kind of thinking about even works that thematize that in your periods, right? I mean, that would be one way. You know, I hadn't thought about this before, but you know, Wordsworth has poem after poem after poem of people unable to pay attention, and the kind of hidden trauma that stands in relationship to that inability to pay attention. You know, Resolution and Independence. That's the one about the leech gatherer, right? Is sort of classical in that way. But but you know, even you know, that question, right? In some sense, already literature has started to think about it. So whether we can use literature to keep thinking about and think differently about these issues is, I think, you know, both an exciting and daunting possibility. So I see we're getting, if my clock is right, pretty near time. You know, not that we've gotten to, you know, all the various questions that I had listed for us to talk about, but I want to thank everyone for your thinking and thinking along with me the questions that we have gotten to. Also wish you well in terms of how those will keep changing. And I guess that leads to one last maybe thought about it is, one of the things I love about syllabi that you pass out at the beginning of a class is you can change it like that. The top line of mine says, this is tentative, don't believe it. You know, it's not a contract. They lied when they told you it was a contract. That was just the administration talking. Now I can get away with that for, you know. But I've never completed a syllabus in my entire 30x years of teaching. It's always changed. 100% of the class, so I guess that's what 140 classes I taught or something. And I don't see, I kind of feel like I have to get it righter this time because I'm thinking about modules that somehow seem to be more rigid than and maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe there are ways of keeping that flexibility. Hey, let's spend another day on this. But when things are asynchronous, and so much of even my class will be semi-asynchronous, right? Some sync, some async. I mean, I don't know that flexibility is still going to be there. Do people have thoughts on that one? That's me throwing out one of my, growing anxieties that I'd be happy to.
Mark, I was going to say that yesterday a speaker mentioned that they were only going to plan 4 weeks ahead. And they're just going to tell the students that, not because they weren't prepared, but because the world is changing so much. And they wanted to be able to keep it, okay, here's what we're going to do, but I'm not going to tell you every lecture I'm going to give, and I'm not going to post everything online, because I want to be responsive to the situation. And even if you're not teaching about the situation, to just recognize, like you said, it's attention span. What I'm noticing is that everything takes twice as long now. Do you know, I'm moving more slowly, or I need more downtime, or I just, I can predict I'm going to get such and such done, but it happens in half that time. So that's true for the students, because I don't have home insecurity, I hope, but you know what I mean? I don't have a lot of things that they're dealing with. So
sure.
Yeah, and so I think
and what they're dealing with.
what you do, yeah.
I actually had just watched President Obama speaking at John Lewis just before this.
Right.
And I wanted to completely rip this all up and do an entirely different discussion.
Right.
Yeah. I didn't. Although I'm glad actually to be able to confess that desire at this moment. And I think confession is important to teaching. But I do feel like that idea of maybe, just don't show the modules, just keep them blind and say, and preserve some flexibility that way. I mean, I just keep thinking, what is the beginning of November and the election going to do?
And it's a balance also between continuing to hold the space in a way that they can trust that you know what you're doing. So you just want to go, oh God, the world's going to hell. I don't even know what we're going to do next week.
Exactly. You need to sort of hold that space as one that remains secure for your students.
Right.
No matter, even while that security can't be a walling off. I mean, that's the curious trick of it. Well, I think it is fairly important to end on time. So I'll try to model that now and get used to it for fall for myself. But thank you all. I really appreciated this conversation. And I'll probably see you in other sessions as people are moving in and about and so on. And again, have a great rest of the conference and a great semester.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Well,